Hello and welcome to episode 3 of Think Piece with me, Max Burnell. This instalment is the last of the mini-series focusing on digital privacy before we move on to take a look at the fascinating subject of artificial intelligence, but more of that later. Coming up, you'll be hearing my conversation with Goldsmiths Global Media and Politics Professor Marianne Franklin. Marianne is an interesting and well-travelled character with an academic background in varied topics from history, music, social and political theory and international relations. Before coming to the UK, she taught at universities in New Zealand, the Netherlands and the US. Recently, her research has focused on human rights issues in the internet, and she's served on the UN Internet of Governance Forum and is currently the chair of the Global Internet Governance Academic Network. Bit of a mouthful there, so I believe they call it GigaNet for short. This interview was recorded earlier in the year against a backdrop of European terror attacks and during the committee stages of the Snoopers Charter. We had a fascinating discussion about encryption, politics, big business and human rights in relation to privacy. She believes there is a centre ground that can be reached in the debate, but highlights the problems associated with cross-border control of the internet and of course cross-border big business with companies like Google, etc. I spoke to her on Skype from New Zealand, so please do excuse the compression. So, without any further ado, I hope you enjoy Think Piece Episode 3 with Professor Marianne Franklin. Alright, okay, so Professor Franklin, thank you ever so much for speaking to me. So, okay, I suppose perhaps we should start. What are the sort of political positions associated with this security or privacy debate? And what sort of role do you think the media plays in framing the topic?
That's two questions in one.
Yeah.
So, fair enough. Because you're right to frame them as one question. These are actually interconnected. So I think to start with the first part, what are the political positions? I think you need to make a distinction between domestic political positions, such as we're seeing in the UK, for instance, and how these debates might play out in other parts of the EU, such as Germany, where they're very different.
Yeah.
In terms of, the German political scene, different again in the Netherlands, and certainly different again down in Turkey, meaning in terms of the southern parts of the larger Europe. So, and then, of course, the positions that are taken at the UN level and other more global international venues where these debates rage just as fiercely. So when you say political positions, if we're meaning party positions, I think in the case of privacy versus security, you will see within the UK a bilateral opposition to the investigatory powers bill. Mm-hmm. Because as you know, Tom Watson and I believe it's David Davis have joined forces to protest this bill on the basis of its undermining fundamental rights and freedoms as inscribed in not only the European Convention on Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and all subsequent charters and treaties and covenants, to be more accurate, to which the UK, the British government, is a signatory. So in that sense, the political positions are interesting in the UK, not strictly defined by Conservatives versus Labour. Mm-hmm. But I think having said that, if you know about the Tom Watson and David Davis allegiance, I think it isn't strictly left versus right, at least in the UK context. It isn't strictly definable by that.
Yeah.
I think, and as we dig deeper and deeper into what it might mean to ensure the sorts of privacy online that, for instance, the German debates are talking about, mm-hmm. or in the Netherlands, where we're talking about each person having a completely identifiable digital identity, which effectively one already has, as a sort of privacy, personal privacy, individualized, encoded, encrypted online identity. So it is very new ground for most political parties. But my point is that the domestic politics play out across these issues differently within the different and between the different members of the EU alone.
Yes.
Let alone if you compare it to, say, different parts of the world where these debates are working at another level of assumptions about state intervention. And I think the thing about encryption is that the large corporations, the corporate service providers that pretty much own and control all we do, have been under pressure in the aftermath of Snowden to ensure that encryption is a default setting, meaning basically to contradict Google's whole modus operandi, which is privacy does not exist online. Now, Google has changed their tune in the aftermath of Snowden, but they used to be a major corporate service provider who did not believe, quote unquote, in privacy as we are now understanding it. But in terms of political parties, I think a lot of political parties in the UK, in the EU, are really struggling with these challenges because they're technical challenges, they're legal challenges, and they're also social and ethical challenges. And I think it's a difficult one. It would be too simplistic to say it's simply a Labour versus Conservative.
Yes.
And I think if you look more deeply at how the voting is going and some of the questions, particularly immediately after Snowden from Keith Vaz, revealing a very strong preference for state security over and above all other rights and freedoms. The problem with the way the media frames these topics and the spin doctors who are steering the media coverage, or the sensations that guide the headline making, is it's posed as an either-or, security, state security versus privacy. It's not true. They're not mutually exclusive, and one should not be put ahead of the other, is the basic UN Human Rights Council position. However, there are two sorts of security we're talking about here. State security, national security is not the same as, say, your security when you're doing your banking online, and the two tend to get muddled up.
Yes, that's a very interesting
point.
It's
very important to decide which security we're talking about, because when I was organising and then moderating a large plenary session in 2014 in Berlin at what is called the European Dialogue on Internet Governance, and that was our theme: human rights, security, privacy, and to try and understand these things as mutual rather than exclusive.
Yes.
But the basic position, I think, on the whole of the so-called left progressive voices are no state security, not at the cost of our rights and freedoms.
Yes.
The domestic situation, how national politics play out in the various parts of the EU, who are all involved in the kind of EU level policy framing and decisions. These are not purely national decisions, despite what the nationalists and the sovereignty people want to say. The internet is by definition cross-border. So this is a huge jurisdiction issue. You can only guarantee a person's privacy online up to a point when they're using a cloud service. So it's highly relative. You cannot define it anymore simply by the national borders, which is how, of course, political parties want to understand it.
Yes.
So it's very difficult. Yeah.
Oh, it's a fascinating area, isn't it? Okay, so do you think perhaps our understanding of privacy has changed from that of previous generations?
Yes, but I remember, first of all, what we mean by privacy and we is a very Western understanding in Western Europe based on the individual, the right to have a private life. This goes back to before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was drafted, and privacy became one of the key rights and freedoms in that document. But it has changed, and the more we understand how different cultures understand privacy, they realize it's very difficult to talk purely of this in terms of an individual person, because there's issues around communities. The fact that in the UK, privacy is understood very differently from, say, I don't want to sort of underscore stereotypes, but say parts of Italy. The idea that what you do in your home is private and nobody's business is understood very differently in other cultures. So privacy is actually becoming in itself as a culturally embedded. But I think privacy's changed because of what people do online. So yes, it has a digital dimension, which is new. And it has also a CCTV dimension, which the online privacy debates are revealing. The UK is one of the most densely CCTV covered countries in the world. So the British citizen has been walking around totally filmed and photographed at all points in time, and yet does not see this as an invasion of their privacy, or privacy, however one says it.
Yes.
So, yes, I never know which way. So it has been changing as we become more and more dependent on web-based communications. And research into how young people use social media suggests there are shifts in how people experience it and how people understand it when it has been, abused. People don't think about you don't think about your privacy until somebody invades it.
So do you think perhaps in regards to, the Twitter posts about what you're having for breakfast or whatever. See, I think former generations might have thought that was sort of voluntarily giving up your privacy, and yet people seem to freely give that up. But do you think it's more about consent? Because we agree to give this information up about ourselves, but we don't necessarily agree to all of our internet browsing history, for example, being made available retrospectively to lawmakers,
Or actually, currently is available to all the corporate service providers we use. Facebook, Twitter, Google, all the cloud service we use, actually, when we tick that box, we are supposedly consenting to having all our metadata stored and archived by that service provider on the basis that it will give us a better quote-unquote experience. It isn't just governments who are data mining and tracking us. It is also the service providers that we are so dependent on as well, quite disproportionately as well, according to many activists. So yes, it is a question of consent, but informed consent is very different from having to tick a box full of small print and not able to use a service unless you abide by their terms and conditions, which basically, in terms of Facebook, is that we know everything about you.
Yes.
Because it's our service, our platform. All your data is for us to know and for you to assume we will treat it properly. And there's been recent scandals around Facebook's use of people's online data for the purpose of experiments, marketing, and all sorts of things.
Yes, that was interesting.
Yeah.
The manipulation, didn't they manipulate some people's news feeds to see how they would react, etc.?
Yes. Oh, good, you're up to date with that, yeah.
Yes.
So that kind of highlights those abuses from the point of view of corporate service providers.
Yes, and it seems to me perhaps that we're, in some ways, we do seem to be looking the wrong way in all this. We're obviously outraged by, seemingly outraged by government intrusion, where perhaps we haven't ticked a box to consent to that intrusion.
Yes, exactly.
We're being manipulated and monetized from corporate interests who aren't ultimately accountable in any way. At least if we don't like what the government's doing, we can vote for another party or something.
At least on paper, yes, that's correct.
Not so easy to replace Google tomorrow, or...
No, you try de-Googling your life like I've been trying. It's almost impossible.
I can imagine.
Yes, but you've hit the point about... my thinking at the moment is that... we'll return to your main questions in a minute. My feeling is there's two issues here. The whole Snowden revelations and the NSA mass surveillance and the prison program we first heard about in 2013... They were all signed on to by these large corporations. Microsoft was one of the first to sign up to the Five Eyes program. This is big business. But did we hear from those corporations back in 2009 when they first signed on? No. Did they make a big fuss about the invasiveness and the disproportionality of these kinds of federal spying programs? No. And corporations have made very, very good PR out of this complete mess that Snowden has revealed in terms of how governments, or at least the US government and its ally, have been disproportionately spying on citizens without our consent and without due cause. That's the point. However, there's not enough being said or examined about just the complicity of corporate service providers. Do they need to take that much data? Do they need to mine it that much? And do they need to archive that much? And privacy activists like Helen Nissenbaum, of course, are starting to say, no, they don't.
Yeah.
And that we must also, so we do need to look both ways. Corporate service providers and state agencies work together to refine these digital tools. There's a whole business in security, online security, in terms of an online surveillance. These are corporate design tools, as well as government deployed tools.
Yes, that's a very good point.
Mm.
Okay, so I could talk about this forever.
I know it's like a Pandora's box. Where were we?
It really is.
So the media do play a role in framing, and political positions depend on the national, the international, the national, the regional, and the international setting. But you cannot confine these positions to a purely national debate. And this is where in the UK it's very striking how insular and disingenuous some of the comments are from leading voices, that it's all about national security at all costs. All these national security measures are being made in collaboration with other countries.
Okay, so in that respect, is the internet itself, being as it is a sort of, it has no regard for national borders, really. Is the internet in need of governance? And if so, how should we go about governing it? I've seen you've done some work around a Bill of Rights for the internet.
Yeah.
And I think they might have adopted something like this in Italy already. Could you explain this a little for us?
Well, in terms of does the internet need governing, it's always been governed. Always. But mainly by technical communities, usually US-based, who meet together, sometimes under the auspices of the UN, but in informal settings, who set the standards, the codes, and so on. It's always been governed in the strictest understanding of the engineering understanding of the term. It is also officially governed in terms of the domain name system by ICANN, which is the Internet Corporation of Assigned Names and Numbers, which is again currently still a US-owned corporation. It's always been governed. The question about internet governance now is what is the role of nation states in setting that agenda and in imposing international human rights norms onto this long-standing practice of figuring it out as you would in any engineering problem. So in that sense, a human rights-based framework for considering what the state of nations, the role of nation states is, has been an intervention for some years to try and open up, try and make more transparent decisions that have always been made behind closed doors and behind our screens. So we all need to disabuse the public to think that the internet was once not governed, now it needs governing, and the best governing bodies of this is the nation state. I think I've argued in other publications that the nation state has left it alone to the private sector for 25 years, and in light of not only the global financial crisis, but the increasing awareness of internet communications from a sort of national security and foreign policy and economic point of view, is now claiming its what should we call it, legal right to impose regulations when it wishes. So there's been a shift in terms of how nation states at the UN and certainly national politicians have understood the governmental role. But to date, it's been pretty much privately run, owned, and governed.
Yes.
Until it breaks some kind of law, and this is where we're in the middle of everything now. Everything has to be reinvented or revisited. Which laws that exist and which international instruments, particularly human rights instruments, still apply, and which need to be re-articulated to make sense for the online environment. And that's the work I've been doing with others on the Charter of Human Rights and Principles for the Internet.
Fascinating work.
Did that answer your question at all? Because that's like, wow, that's a huge question.
Yeah, no, it is a huge question. It was a very comprehensive answer. It was, thank you. It seems like we've touched upon a few of these already, actually. So,
Okay.
What's your opinion on this often sort of bandied phrase, if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear? Is there a logic in that? Or?
Well, there's a famous quote by Snowden himself saying, everybody's got something to hide. And I don't quite know how he puts it, but I think you could probably look it up. he makes a very astute comment. Everyone's got something to hide, so this is complete nonsense. This is a conservative position. It is identified, at least in the UK, with more conservative party voting voices. But everyone has something to hide. And the trouble, once you let fundamental rights and freedoms go and you create these huge online surveillance machines, which already exist, but you legitimize them by passing laws such as the Investigatory Powers Bill, you actually lay the groundwork for the abuse of rights in such a way that we've never seen. And that's Snowden's point. He says it far more elegantly than I have done, but yeah.
Yeah, I think I heard him at one point say something, he compared it to freedom of speech. Just because you don't care about freedom of speech, it's probably, again, probably more eloquently than I'm saying it, but it's probably because you've got nothing to say,
Yeah, that's the point, yeah. So we've got everything to fear when we're talking about tools that are being developed that will, like we saw in the film or in the novel, Minority Report, remember?
Yes,
Tom Cruise, the film in 2006 or 2004, where these precognitive programs are being developed right now using our metadata, trillions and millions of God knows how many terabytes, how many acres and acres and acres of databases are being used to try and computate whether you can predict a terrorist attack like we've just seen in Belgium. But as a security expert said, he said, if you know what the telltale signs are, you don't need a computer. But so what makes me even more concerned at the moment with the aftermath of these 3 recent attacks and bombings and the death that's incurred is that we're going to see, of course, a knee-jerk reaction from national governments and the EU itself, where rights and freedoms like privacy, the right to freedom of movement, the right to information, free speech and all that sort of thing are going to be completely, negated in order to set up these huge programs that are supposedly going to sweep the web to find who these terrorists are. 15 out of 15 suspects and perpetrators of the recent attacks were already known to the authorities.
Okay, so we touched upon quite a few of these questions already. So, why do we want to be private in our communications, and why is it so important? And perhaps, why is it so particularly important to journalists and free speech?
Well, let's start with journalists first of all. It's almost impossible now for a journalist to protect their sources online. Even with encryption, that can be cracked. And also some argue that encryption is actually like a big red flag to a bull if you're a journalist and you're known to the authorities as one. For instance, in places like Turkey, right? Or investigative journalists. So we're not talking about privacy in the case of journalism here. We're talking about protection of sources. Obviously, they overlap, but they're protected by different sorts of regulations and laws. So there's a different set, particularly at the UN, and at the EU, at the European level, there are different laws governing the protection of sources for journalists. But of course, their own privacy, their own personal space, their domestic, their home life, their working life is also being intruded into more and more, by more and more invasive forms of surveillance of what they do. So, in order for us to have a healthy society, and for journalists to do the work when they do it properly and do it well, it's crucial that they can protect their sources in ways that are affordable and feasible. But they're running greater and greater risks, journalists, because, for instance, nowadays don't even contact a source if you think there's going to be any issues by email. That is effectively a public interface. Your mobile phone can be tracked. All messages can be subpoenaed. Mm-hmm. If you're using a US-based service provider, all your data can be subpoenaed by the US government. And that's what the IP bill is trying to have the equivalent of in the UK.
Now, I've heard, I was speaking to this encryption expert, and he was making the point that in the Investigatory Powers Bill, as they're suggesting that they would require tech companies to decrypt information. There's a real danger with building so-called backdoors into any system. That once it's been opened for one person, then it's very likely that those who might wish to do us harm could also get their hands on this information once the door's been opened. Do you think this is an issue?
Yeah, I think it is. If you look at it purely from a technical point of view, the question is, I think most techies would say at the end of the day, no code is uncrackable. From the point of view of the ordinary citizen, encryption is for many people cumbersome. And the Council of Europe at the moment, its Internet and Human Rights division, has been advocating for some time now under their privacy focus, privacy by default online, which implies encryption by default, right? But then you're giving enormous power to the encryptors and the decryptors, the encoders and the decoders. So it raises another set of ethical questions. My issue is from the point of view of an ordinary citizen just trying to get about their daily business, right? Why should we have to encrypt everything we do in order to avoid being disproportionately spied upon by either our governments or our service providers? What protections and certainly what kind of redress do we have? That means what kind of legal remedies does an ordinary person have when they perceive that their personal data is being misused by, say, Facebook or by the UK government? None. There is no redress. There are a few individual cases like Max Schrems against Facebook, and he's won a huge victory. One could say it's a Pyrrhic victory, because what does it mean for the rest of us? But arguing that Facebook did misuse did misuse their access to his private data. But I think it's really troubling to think that we now have to encrypt our emails to our teachers, our supervisors, our parents, our loved ones, just in order to have a life. I mean, that's just an atrocious state of affairs.
Yes.
If I could put it sort of quite emotionally, that's where we're heading. So if it's encryption by default, that means it gets done for you, which is how, of course, the mobile phone operators are now proceeding. And remember, back in 2011, the UK government, Cameron's government, was getting all hot under the collar about the fact that the young people who were rioting were using Blackberries, which had their own SMS system.
Yes.
And the government couldn't break it. Quite frankly, I think the IP bill has built in, according to experts, some modicum of checks and balances in terms of the due process a law enforcement agency or a surveillance agency would have to go through in order to access our data. But the point is, they already have our data. These are all about data retention and how long you can hold on to these huge databases of you and I talking right now, the metadata record of you and I's conversation right now.
Yes.
Once that data is retained, it can be accessed. The laws can change later. So we've got two issues. The fact that these providers and governments are already archiving and hanging on to all of this knowledge, all these data, and now they want to have laws that allow them to access it when they wish to. This is different from normal surveillance. Normal surveillance is you need to get a warrant to be able to observe someone who you think is a criminal. This is criminalizing by default. So there's a huge the moral compass has gone completely haywire.
I was speaking to a professor of the philosophy of information, Professor Floridi, and he made the point that your whole past is being stored that could possibly be used in the future. It's making an imprint. And in so doing, it's denying us the ability to be able to change almost. And evidence might be dug up from our past to support, a case against us in the future. And that this has never been an issue before, and it's a really pressing thing that lots of people don't seem to think about.
True, but I mean, there is a little bit of a trade-off here. Back in the 90s, this was already, when we were all rejoicing and be able to go online without having to use our real names and things like that. This idea that we were on one great big public park was a wonderful feeling. secure transactions for banking and payments notwithstanding, just the sort of everyday interaction. That was a glorious time. But of course now it's become commercialized and monetized, and we have some of the world's largest corporations now actually own and control those very everyday communications. This archiving of our lives is in fact going on in ways that we hadn't foreseen, no. But photo albums and all that sort of thing are also available for later generations to pick through and draw inferences from. It's a question of the scale, the scale that we now have because of the ability, because storage costs nothing and digital data can be compressed. So, even on a personal point of view, we can put our whole lives in digital format and upload it onto our various devices for our own use and enjoyment later.
Yes.
But the difference now is that is all interconnected in ways that are kind of cool. But since Snowden, we've now realized it's interconnected for one, huge commercial purposes. Companies are making money out of our interactions. And also, of course, the whole issue around abuses from the point of view of law enforcement and state security apparatuses. So the ordinary user, the ordinary citizen is being squeezed from both sides. And I think it's a real kind of loss of innocence time. But I wouldn't want to sort of suggest that just because we're online, before then we didn't have personal archives. And before then we didn't have pasts. We wouldn't want to be seen, like all those old photo albums of our parties when we were undergraduates. Difference is they're now all online as opposed to being stuck in the back of a shelf.
Yes.
And the ownership and control issue is even more important. If they're being posted on Pinterest or Tumblr or Facebook, who owns those images? It's not immediately clear that they're ours to keep.
So that's a very good point. Okay, so perhaps just on a final point, what do you think it is about surveillance that is perhaps so damaging? Do you think it changes who we are on some kind of level?
Not if you don't know about it.
Yeah.
Not if you don't care. But if you do care and do know about it, I think it changes the way you think about what you do and what you say when you even write an email. And you should think about what you say and do when you write an email in the workplace, because that is in fact not your private domain. And emails can also be subpoenaed. Employers can also request our email records from their server. But when I think it does change. I think there has been a chilling effect for many people in the West who've grown up and become dependent on this way of communicating via their Facebook page. But also, there's research that shows that young people, teenagers, who know their mum and dad are on their Facebook page soon learn how to code what they say. And they don't need encryption for that. They can just change words. You don't need. I think there's a tendency to want the high-tech solution, which is suitable for certain instances. But as the late Caspar Bowden would say, there is no such thing as, locked and sealed ultimate privacy online. As in, you can do what you want and no one can find you. But there is the right to be left alone, as that sort of more moral, ethical right. And as Joe Kanatachi, who's the brand new UN Special Rapporteur for Privacy, says, there's also what he calls a right to have a personality. So that's him saying, okay, so you've got a grotty photo of yourself drunk and disorderly in Ibiza last summer on your Facebook page. So what? That shouldn't be able to be used against you. So, and he goes on far more sophisticated ways to argue about the right to have a personality means that we should be able to be online without fear of punishment for what we did last year if we didn't break the law. So I don't know if that answers your question, but... Yeah,
no, it definitely does. I that's everything I've got, I think. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Not really. I feel like, it's I suppose the main thing is to try and understand privacy in a culturally sensitive way, and to realise security and privacy are intertwined and not mutually exclusive legally in legal terms. But that I think this is a whole new domain in which most of us are working. And I think if you talk to people who are, young people who are 10, 11, 12 years old, and then to people who've just discovered the internet, I was in a research situation, so my last word would be, it's still really exciting. If you come from a disadvantaged community, or if you're, for instance, homeless, I've done work with homelessness and how they use these technologies and these media. So exciting to be able to connect in ways you couldn't before because of physical or financial disadvantage. Still exciting. It is still exciting to go online and to discover a whole new world. And my real problem is that the securitization and this commercialization is going hand in hand with securitization of our online lives, but also there's a criminalization of our everyday life that is not just online. It happens when we come and go from the airport. Being fingerprinted is a form of criminalization. It's become normalized, but only criminals used to get fingerprinted, not ordinary citizens leaving an airport.
Yes.
So once again, remember, 15 out of 15 suspects and perpetrators of the recent terrorist attacks over the last few years were already known to the police by good old-fashioned police work.
It's a worrying thought.
It is worrying.
It is. It really is. But there's reason to be optimistic, as you say.
I don't know if there's how many reasons to be cheerful, as Ian Drury sings, but yeah. Yeah,
it's an exciting time to be alive, I think, and to be thinking about these questions.
Well, yes, I think the so-called digital natives really need to start pushing back and really need to start reconfiguring these discourses in ways that make sense.
Yeah.
But the corporates and the governments and the technical communities are all complicit in some of these processes, and others are also engaged in fighting back. Yeah.
So there you have it, my friends. Some interesting points there, I hope you'll agree. As I said, that was the last of the digital privacy for now. Next time we'll begin our exploration of a subject that I find absolutely fascinating. Bizarrely, a subject that we've been thinking of since ancient times, and that brings into question our very nature and role in the universe as humans and conscious beings. I am, of course, talking about artificial intelligence. I'm looking forward to bringing you my discussions with some of the foremost experts on the controversial and entirely fascinating subject. Exciting stuff indeed, so be sure to stay tuned for that. As always, if you'd like to get in touch, send an email to contact.thinkpiece@gmail.com. Find the podcast on Facebook and Twitter, and please do be sure to get liking and sharing. So, thanks for listening, and until next time, take care.
Peace.